Hello everyone and welcome to episode 39 of the Book Talk Today podcast. Today we are joined by Fiona Buckland. Fiona is an international coach, facilitator, author and speaker who has worked one-to-one with hundreds of clients and led thousands in public and corporate workshops, training and events. Today we'll be discussing her book, Thoughtful Leadership, A Guide to Leading with the Mind, Body and Soul. Fiona, it's a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you all for asking me.
You're welcome. I think the topic of leadership is fascinating. I've read many books on the subject, and I think in current times, leadership is more important than ever. I know we're both in the UK, so we've probably seen a lot of the news at the moment surrounding COVID-19 and some of the mishaps with Dominic Cummings and Number 10. It's interesting. It's an interesting time for leadership. So I think before we get into some of the topics and themes within the book, I would like to know your thoughts around what thoughtful leadership is, which is the title of your book.
Thanks. Yes, may you live in interesting times. It's a Chinese proverb, and it wasn't meant to talk about good stuff, right? So thoughtful leadership, basically. I loved hearing what you said about how important leadership is in the world and how important it is to you. Because, you know, we need good leaders. And what I mean by good leaders is thoughtful leaders. The impact that leaders have when they're not being thoughtful are kind of surround us. We see them, really clearly. We see them in poor decision making, in confused messages, in not being transparent. All of these things mean that the people who people want to be led by are left in a kind of state of confusion, disengagement, and lack of trust. This is incredibly important and becoming more so because really good, thoughtful leaders think very carefully about the impact that they're having. Because when you become a leader, you're actually volunteering for stress and you're volunteering to be in the spotlight and you're volunteering to have that impact. Guess what? It was never always just about your ego, though that's not a bad thing, and maybe we can talk about that later. But what you're really taking responsibility for is your world, and you're thinking about it generations going forward, not just of your company or your organization or your project or your community or your family, but of all living beings going forward. They used to say 7 generations going forward. So a thoughtful leader is thinking deep. What is the impact that I'm having, that I want to have? And is thinking forward in time. They're like brilliant time travelers and can see perhaps the impact of what they're doing. Not least on this, because the leaders, and we might want to think about this, when you're a leader, what you're doing is you're setting the bar and setting a model for what leadership is in the future as well. So that's the bar that you're setting. That's the impact that you're having, not just on your little bit of the world, but on all leadership going forward. So think about that. That's what thoughtful leadership is. Why it requires your whole self. So not just your mind, but your, as I said, the subtitle says, with your mind, body, and soul, is that you need to bring all of you to do this. You can have leaders who are brilliant, whose intellectual capabilities were just, someone like Bill Gates who completely, has extraordinary intellectual capabilities. But unless you can actually impact a room with your presence when you walk in, and by the way, that doesn't mean being the big I am, but being aware of how your body, of how you are, is part of the message of your leadership as well. And also your soul, that you have a deep connection to your calling and a deep connection to service to the world as well. That's what I mean by thoughtful leadership.
Yeah, I like the trifecta that you talk about in the subtitle. I think it's very important because I think when people think about leadership, they definitely think of the person with the brawn and who's commanding everyone. I know you touched upon it briefly just then. Can you talk about the ego and perhaps the misconceptions surrounding ego and leadership?
Right. So we all need ego. I'm not anti-ego. We need our ego. What is an ego? It's a sense of self, and we need our ego in order to make things real in the material world, right? And also to sit into a room, and for us to have this conversation, for you to set up a podcast, right? It's like I have a self-belief, and from that self-belief or that desire comes making something in the world, and we can call that kind of ego.
Having a massive ego.
Well, but there's the other side, right? Did I just say that about you? Maybe I did, yeah.
Slightly.
But you see what I mean? But that's a good thing, right? Because you put something out into the world, which is good, right? Sure. But if you're only doing it for your ego, if you're only doing it to make yourself feel big, to be the kind of, the big guy on the block or what have you, then guess what? You're probably cruising for a bruising at some point as well, because the ego we talk about the ego monster that just needs more and more and more and more, right? It's never enough. There's something in there then maybe about what the Buddhists call the hungry ghost. I love that metaphor. It's that you can eat all you want, but you're never full because you're not really getting what nourishes you. And for the ego, it can never really be enough. And if it's only for yourself, whereas if you think about what you're doing, the impact that you're having in the world and how you're helping people or how you're serving people or how also you're setting an example for people, you've got a much deeper and richer base to come from, one that will support you as well, right? Because the problem with ego-led leadership is that if something goes wrong, that doesn't feel too good for the ego, right? You can get deflated very, very quickly. You can't do that in leadership. It's a long game. It's a long game every day. Someone said to me, it is like sprinting a marathon, but it's like that every day. And if the only resource that you have is your self-esteem, and you don't temper that with a real sense of self-compassion for yourself as a flawed and imperfect human being, then you're really not going to be very resilient. And not only that, but you're going to possibly, not you personally, but an ego-led leader is going to cause more damage because of their need for affirmation. They're going to bully people. They're going to feel the need to be in command and control rather than actually really empowering people around them. Yeah. And they're going to surround themselves with yes people. People who are only going to tell them what they want to hear because they can't bear to have people around them who don't hold up that shiny mirror to them. So that's my little take on ego there.
Yeah, I like it. I like how you caveated it at the end that it's not to do with me, which is nice. Can you just talk about, you touched on it briefly just then about resilience in leadership, because I think often the best leaders or the most proficient leaders over a long period of time are usually the most resilient, not only to the obstacles they overcome, but also to the fatigue and the stress related to leadership, which I don't think near enough people talk about. So can you just talk about, through working with your clients and your experience, how a leader can become more resilient and whether resilience is one of the main traits to being a good leader?
Yeah, thank you. I think you've hit the nail on the head. It's essential. And you're right, people don't talk about the stress enough. When you're a leader, and also, anyone can be a leader, I mean, to a certain extent. But when you're a leader, you're volunteering for more stress. Yeah. My brother, I say to him, I work with leaders, and he's like, what is it with people? Why can't they just go home at 5 o'clock, have a cup of, make their tea, go to the gym, watch a bit of TV. He's a really great leveler for me to have around. But for people who volunteer for leadership, it's stress all the time. And most of the people with whom I work, they're not even working in one time zone. And they're working with incredibly complex organizations now, many, many moving parts. They've got, a lot of pressure on them because they're public. If they fail, they're also taking responsibility. Yeah. The rap's on them. And not only that, but they can also be taken down publicly, not just through the traditional media, but also through social media as well, yep. From which there is very, very little accountability. So you wonder why these people can't sleep at night. The difficulty with that is that there's that sense of man up, man up, which is an interesting phrase, really, when you think about it, because, it's as someone once said to me, well, that's interesting, because it's the women who really take the pounding and having babies.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. It's like, genetically speaking, it's the women that are more resilient, so...
Women who are probably a bit more resilient, but that doesn't I'm actually, we've kind of sneaked kind of gender in there. Maybe that was, I'm not deliberately putting that in there, but let's kind of follow it. One of the things certainly with men and in leadership, who are the majority, is that they find it very, very difficult to talk about their feelings. And one of the first things to being resilient is to be able to acknowledge that you are struggling, or to acknowledge that something is disappointing. Because something will always happen. There will always be setbacks. There will always be disappointments. There will always be stress. You can be going along really well, and then wallop, something comes and your whole business model is thrown, or a tweet is surfaced that you wrote 10 years ago and has now come back to haunt you, and whatever it might be. Which is happening a lot. What men don't do is they don't talk about their feelings. They find it very difficult to allow other people to acknowledge their feelings as well in leadership. The unspoken story of men in leadership is insomnia, heart disease, drinking, broken relationships, all of these things. I mean, I've got a couple of wonderful male coaches that I know that work specifically in this area to get more men in leadership to talk about this. It's incredibly difficult. Now, what has that got to do with resilience? If you cannot acknowledge your feelings, I always say to people, if you don't know where you are, then how do you know what you need? And how can you ask for help? That's the other thing. Leadership is lonely. If you think about it, very often leaders are at the top of one pyramid, but they're at the bottom of another. They've got investors, they've got boards,
customers,
and they've got the sort of general public. They've got customers, they've got stakeholders, so they really are under a lot of pressure and often very alone. They very rarely have someone that they can turn to and say, I'm freaking out a bit here, or I'm really struggling, or if the business was this, I've also got my kids at home who are running riot, and one of them's developed a heart condition, and my partner is. So this applies both to sort of men and women. So that puts even more pressure into that area. And resilience is not about having a stiff upper lip. Resilience is about when the inevitable brickbat hits, when things do fall apart, and they do. Can you hold through it, not just yourself, but the people that you're with and leading? And can you move through that into an even stronger position? With deeper self-knowledge, better resourced, deeper commitment, beliefs, coherence, connection to other people, trust. That's what we mean by resilience, a kind of growth from adversity, if you like. And it's really difficult to do that if you cannot acknowledge your feelings, if you don't take care of yourself. And leaders at all times have got to be aware of their stress levels and the impact that it's having on their bodies. I work a lot with people who are coming up into leadership, like have just been promoted, or are, starting their own businesses or their own practices or whatever it might be. And the first thing that goes out of the window is self-care. The first thing that goes out of the window is that, 20-minute run that they would do every day, or that bit of yoga stretching, or the being in the garden tending, whatever it was that relieved their stress. It's the first thing that goes, and it should never go. It really should never go. So, and then who you're going to talk to, and then how you're going to see things as a fork in the road. And then also, how do you know what your values are, so that when things hit, that you can keep going as well. So there has to be an ability to do a bit of self-reflection as well, which is a really powerful aspect of resilience. Then, of course, doing all of this, and then leading your team, your group, your company, your organization to do that as well.
Where you touched on it briefly just then, where's the relationship between self-reflection and self-awareness, leadership and resilience? Like, where is that relationship, and how does someone who is managing a business, managing their career, managing a family, have that time to dedicate to self-awareness and reflection in a busy schedule?
I'm so glad you're asking this. It's such an important thing, because the first thing that people say is, well, I don't have time. I don't have time. The truth is that you do somehow have to make time, but it's incredibly difficult to do so, I know. So there has to be a fair amount of, your question was self-reflection. I would say to people, there's a myth that, and I hear it a lot, well, I'll just get to the end of this quarter and then I'll go
Yeah,
on holiday,
that quarter
right?
never ends.
And they go on holiday. That quarter never
Yeah,
ends, right? It was a never-ending quarter. Or they're into the next quarter, because guess what?
yeah,
It never stops. But also, when you do go away, you're there with your phones. There's that famous story, and it is a true one, of people sitting around in a very nice hotel in the, I think it was in the Caribbean, like Sandy Lane's, one of these, like, 8-star hotel kind of things, and people are sitting around the pool and having a lovely time, and then suddenly everyone's phone starts ringing at the same time, and Lehman Brothers has just gone bust. And everyone's just running to the airport and getting back on their private planes and getting back to their offices because the
yeah,
sky's falling in. And it's this sense of, you can't go away without, people feel as if they can't go away without their phones. They're checking in their emails all the time. They're not setting boundaries around themselves, and they're not integrating good practices in. So this myth of you can take a 2-week holiday and then you'll get your rest is apt, and your reflection is rubbish. Or you have your retreat or your away day. It's the same thing. You really do need to, as a leader, integrate practices into your everyday life that help, and into your week. And you need to, you are the leader. So you are also modeling this kind of behavior for other people. So when you say, okay, it's Friday and it's 5 o'clock and we're going home, or I'm going to take, I'm from 4 to 5 on Friday is my hour when I sit down and I do reflection. Is otherwise also known as
okay.
strategic thinking,
That's
rather than
yeah.
reacting to stuff all the time,
That's a
right? If you
nice
think
that's a
about
nice
it,
title. I like that.
it's, yeah, you have to do that part. Self-reflection. Now, how am I doing? What do I need to keep going through this next piece? Who are the people that I need around me? What are the skills that I need? What are the messages that I need? I've got a big board meeting coming up. Okay, I don't just charge in there and tell people what I want. How am I going to work the strategy around that? Who do I need to talk to first? I need some time to really reflect on this. Let's have a think about the vision of the company. What's coming around the corner? What's changing in the world? What am I noticing? What am I reading? What am I hearing that I need to pay attention to? That is essential part. That perspective part of leadership is really essential. Otherwise, you're managing. If you're not able to see around the corners, and not only to see what's coming, but also to create what's coming, right? That you need that self-reflection time. Yeah, it's essential. Or as I always call it as well, there's also responding, not just reacting, but responding. So, the essential of thoughtful leadership, if you like, is noticing that something's coming up that you're noticing you're starting to get reactive to, managing your kind of, your inner emotions, and just being able to go, okay, you know what? Rather than answer that, I'm going to ask you, like, what do you think? What do you think about this? I want to hear from everybody else, or I want to give people an opportunity to feel empowered here, or I want to make sure I don't blow up because this is not the moment to do it.
Definitely. Well, one of the things I've touched on briefly is like intrinsic values. And I know that some of the best leaders that are out there and the most proficient ones are the ones that have a strong value set. They know what their values are. They're very attuned to that, and their guiding principles and their actions are based on those values. So how do individuals go about creating a set of values if they don't already have some? And what are some of the techniques that they can use to establish their own value framework? Or you might have a better term for it. I'm sure you have a better term for it, but
No, I think that's you're bang on the money with the value framework. So it's a great question. Let me start with saying what you don't do.
Okay,
right?
yeah, let's do that.
Go and find, let's do that.
Google.
Right? You don't Google. Exactly.
What are my values?
Exactly. Yeah. Don't Google list of values and then go and tick them off. Right? Because you will end up with a list of values that might be your aspired values, or the values that you think are more learned behaviors. So, let me give you an example. I could look at a value like self-discipline. And I'd look at it and I'd go, yeah, I'm disciplined. Obviously, I've written a book, you got to get up every morning, you got to do it. Yeah, that's the secret of success, obviously something that I value. But if you said to me, you could have your dream life, but you'd never have to have any self-discipline in it, I'd probably go for it, to be honest with you. But if you said to me, you could have your dream life, but you couldn't operate with compassion, Fiona, or, you wouldn't be able to work with people, you'd be working with just technology and algorithms, or I couldn't do that. I mean, I couldn't. It would like ripping my guts out. It just feels completely wrong and inauthentic to me. So that's what you don't do. You don't go and get a list, because it's also easy. What you do, if you can, is you get a coach, or you do this exercise like this, which I do, and isn't in the book as well. So it's called it's a kind of peak, what they call peak experience exercise. So you basically, you think about a time when you felt really alive. Make it specific, and if it's tricky for you, then maybe think about what your ideal day would be like. But it's better to get a memory. Then you go through that memory. Like, for instance, I might say, can I do this with you now?
Let's do it.
I'm doing
free session. Let's go for it.
All right. Free session. Okay. You'll get my invoice afterwards.
Hopefully not. I won't respond.
All right. So you're excellent. That's the best way to do it. So look, here we go. Think about a time when you feel or when you felt really alive. And remember that alive doesn't necessarily mean calm. It could mean really stressed out because there's a deadline or there's a challenge and you've got to step up and up your game. So have you got something?
So yeah, I mean, one of the things that I felt recently was the fact that, so I've taken on this new endeavor of having like a career switch. So I do this podcast and I speak to authors, which is for me an amazing opportunity, but I'm also changing from finance analyst to becoming a software engineer. And recently a time I felt alive was the fact that I had like 15 podcasts scheduled, and I just had this moment of sitting there thinking, oh my god, this is like a thing now. And in the past I thought about like how cool would this be to speak with authors. Like for years I've been thinking about it because I love to read, obviously, and I just have this moment of just, in Arabic it's called like khushu', which is like contentment. And I was just like, this just feels right, that I've got all this scheduled and I'm speaking with these authors and I just feel that feels right. And I would say that was one of the moments recently.
I love that. That's a really, really great one. I love that you brought the Arabic word in too. Okay, so let me ask you a question then. And to listeners, this is where you go a little bit deeper, right? And I would say to you, so what's important about that? So you've got those 15 podcasts, you've got that sense of contentment. What's important about that?
The importance for me is because I know the value that these conversations give to me and then the listeners as well. So there's that part of it. I know there's the value, and obviously the authors like yourself sharing the message, but also to myself because I learn so much, and also for the listeners because they learn so much. But it's also the fact that I know that this is the direction that I want to go in the fact that I want to be doing this a lot more, and I know that I want to be speaking with more authors and growing the podcast, and for it to become something that I am associated with. So that's why it's important for me to make sure that's being done.
No. So what I would do then, I've been listening, and you might want to listen to yourself, and people, if you haven't got a coach, write it down, because then you can read it again or record it and listen to it. So what I'm listening to are particular things. So when you mention the word learning a lot. So I might say that learning is a really important value for you.
It's
learning
the most important one.
You want to kind of bingo, right? There's also, it feels to me like there's a sense of achievement in there. Like you've really worked hard at this, and you've got to a point where you're going, my God, this is it. This is really happening. I've done it. So there's a real sense of self-achievement, right?
Yeah.
And that's important. Yeah. So what you would want to do as well always is to keep looking to learn and to increase your sense of achievement. And there's also something here about impact as an important value as well. So now that might not be the right word. It might be connection with other people, affecting other people, making a difference, or it might just be impact. Is that could be ego? But that, that's in there too. You want to reach other people. You want to affect them, and you want to affect a change in them of learning, of pleasure, of, engagement
I
with
think,
the world?
I think for me it's the fact
Okay.
that I know that how much value that I've derived from learning and from books in particular, and I know that the impact it's had
Yeah.
on me, and I just want to share that with other people because I think it's really important.
Right. There you go. Sharing. Sharing
Yeah.
is a really important thing. It's not good enough for you just to have it for yourself. It's like, now this
Yeah,
is a
because I'm
good thing.
like,
I want to share this.
I'm reading these books and I've got these ideas, and there's, for me, they're like mind blowing. I'm like, people need to know about this. Like today I posted a book, and I'm speaking with another author later about one of these books. He hasn't written it, but one of the topics of conversation is around a book written in the mid 1980s called Amusing Ourselves to Death by Neil Postman. And I'm like, why haven't more people read this? Like, more people need to read this. And so it's just sharing that with other people, stuff like that.
I knew Neil
Oh,
Postman.
did you?
I was at NYU,
Oh, no
and
way.
I took a road trip with him.
Oh my God, that's crazy.
I didn't know who he was
Oh,
really, because he was my partner's professor, his kind of dad, if you like. I mean, he's an amazing character. And so he went to this place. We were going to this retreat up into the Catskills where he was giving this big speech, and my partner and me were with him, and off we went up there. And as he came off stage and everyone was going, Neil, he came to me and said, how did you think I did there, Fiona? Do you think that was okay? Because, of course, he knew I was the only person in the room who was like, at the time, I don't know. Are you any good? Like, do people know who you are? But yeah, so it's a great book. And, of course, he, again, was ahead of his time in a way of really naming some of the stuff that is still crazily relevant today. I like to think of him somewhere just kind of checking in and going, yeah. He was a very wry person. He had a passion for education. That was where he came from at all times. And it's really important to remember that. We call people thought leaders, but at the time he was, very, very committed to education and to the media ecology. Which is just another beast entirely now.
Definitely. Well,
anyway, we got off
what a segue, but what a small world. Love it.
Yeah, from your values, which were, so you asked the question about values, and it's interesting talking about Neil, right? Because here's a man who, in some ways, knowing him as a man rather than as a great teacher. I could see what he was doing as a human being. His very avuncular style, the fact that he really mentored people, how important education was to him, and how he felt that media literacy was part of our cultural toolkit that we needed in order to participate in a democratic world. So he wasn't just, that was also about sharing. It was also about educating for him. Essentially, very, very important for him. He was old school. Yeah,
I like that. And in his book, he's very. I like the fact that it seemed to me that he was very proactive in making sure that people knew about the distinctions and about the new media and about how they are affecting you and your behavior and the way in which you see the world, which to me is great. And I feel like that's perhaps a shared value that we both have.
So that was a long way talking around how you might find your values.
Yeah.
And why that's really important, because we can talk about Neil and we can talk about what his values were, and we can see them in action, not just the kind of list that you tick off, like we can with you. You're walking your talk.
Do you think it's important then for people to perhaps see people that they admire or people that they respect, and to see whether they have shared values with them and derive values that way?
I think that's part of that's part of the job of leadership, right? Is that from this side of it, and it's something that leaders need to be aware of, because you're by osmosis influencing people. When you're very clear about your values as a leader, then yes, people will be attracted to you. They will want to work with you. But you also have to, as I said just now with you, you've got to walk your talk. You've got to show integrity. They can't just be we really value this on the kind of above the door frame, but the minute you walk in, there's just that thing yesterday with Brewdog, and I don't know if it's true or not, but certainly there seems to be a mass which is like there's a real disconnect between the values that you espouse and the values of actually what it's like to work with you.
I mean,
and that's where you've got a real problem.
For that one as well, in particular, it's like if it's just one employee, then you're like, okay, but when you have 60 ex-employees writing, you're like, maybe there's something wrong there.
Yeah, and their response was interesting, right? Because initially it seemed like there was a kind of, a certain kind of response, which you could say was a kind of old command and control leadership thing, which is everybody must sign this memo by 10:30, and this is a demeaning thing. And then the other one that came out saying, oh, we're listening and learning.
Yeah.
But it's listening and learning. Action's got to be the thing now. That's what people want now. They want action, like show us, walk the talk. Yeah. And a lot of what I think is happening around Black Lives Matter, Me Too, is like enough. Like walk the talk now. It's enough. Yeah,
definitely. I would agree with that. One of the things I want to talk about, actually, I recently read the book 21 Lessons for the 21st Century by Yuval Noah Harari. It's a great book. In that, he talks about stress to the degree that it's prevalent in our society at the moment because there's rapid change. And rapid change, whether it be in technology or in society in general, just brings stress because that's just how we're biologically, that's our biological makeup. So can you just talk about stress and leadership and combating stress, some tactics perhaps, or just how to manage that when you're in this process of evolution to becoming a leader or as a leader?
You've got to manage stress, as I said. You're volunteering for it as a leader. I mean, it's for all of us as well. There are basically, I call it like a kind of three-step process, if you like. The first thing you've got to do is notice. You've got to know that you're under stress. And there's that difference from that kind of good stress. I mean, you could have looked at your 15 podcasts and going, oh my God, that's it, I'm way overworked. But you got excited by it, which is that positive stress, right? The negative stress is when you cannot sleep and you're really stressing out, and maybe you've got imposter syndrome going on, and or you're just overwhelmed. I mean, there's so much on people's plates nowadays. So you've got to notice what your warning signs are for stress. And I always go through with people that there are 5 stress reactions to watch out for. None of them are bad or wrong. They just are. They're part of our evolution. So most people have heard of fight and flight, but there's also freeze, which is that kind of rabbit in the headlights when things go to pieces. Fold, which is that kind of victim, oh, this always happens to me. Oh, okay, then, all right, I won't have the promotion. And friend, which is whenever there's a stressful situation. I always say to people, imagine if someone like prangs your car, it's their fault, but you get out of your car and go, it's okay, I'm not a problem. That's a stress response, because it means that you're already trying to avoid confrontation. Yeah. And confrontation is sometimes good, right? Or assertion, like, hey, you know what, you pranked my car, mate. So you've got to know what your stress response is. When I say that, people already might go, oh, wait a minute. I mean, I know that I've got a freeze response, which is quite interesting. People sometimes think I'm really calm in a stressful situation, which I can be, partly because I grew up in a very stressful household. But I can sometimes freeze, and people think I'm being aloof. And actually, I've got a process by which, so I have to notice I'm freezing. So notice that awareness. Second, acceptance. This is the reality. This is what's happening. Don't try and create a little story in your head. And also acceptance in the sense of, like somebody is doing this to me. That's a story, right? It's not reality. You're having an evolutionary stress response is what's happening, right? Nobody's making this happen. It's happening. Also self-acceptance, practice some self-compassion. You are a human being who's doing your best. That's it. That's all. There are lots of really wonderful self-compassion exercises that you can do. For instance, you can just connect with yourself. Like, what would a really compassionate friend say to you right now in this situation, right? So when you've done those two, and you can do those in a moment, it sounds like, well, I have to go away and find a little space to do that. You can do that. But then you also have got the opportunity to choose. You can choose to reduce that stress. And I've got some techniques in the book, like centering, which is a way that you work through your body to take the stress out of it. Because stress is a body-mind. It's not, people think that their brains are like, their bodies are like brain taxis, but they're not. It's all related. So we work through the nervous system in an instant. I just did it right then. Right, just to, you loosen your belly, loosen your jaw, visualize, imagine yourself shining out. that takes your stress, like your body neurologically, offline enough for you to go, okay, how do I want to respond to this? How do I want to deal with this? You also have to notice what the other stress signs are. I mentioned not being able to sleep, or, when you come back at the end of the day and you want to relax, or nowadays still, you might be at home. And just as you put a bottle of water to your lips, I'm assuming it is, but for some people, they get into the habit of coming back and they're like, oh, I'm just going to have a drink at the end of the day. And then maybe it's 2, and maybe it's 3, and maybe it's every day. And just to notice that, you've got to come off automatic, because your stress response and the way that you cope with it very quickly will become your default, right? So you've got to kind of come off it. You've got to notice if somebody says something to you in a meeting and you automatically start going, hey, guess what? That means the membrane's stretched a little bit too thin, right? It's okay to get, to get angry at stuff. But if it's, haranguing people, if it's always, no matter every little thing that happens, you're freaking out, guess what? Warning sign, help apply. So that's kind of what I would sort of sound about stress. And it is essential to monitor this all the time.
Yeah. One of the things you said in that piece just then was this separation between the I that does everything, and the I that is responsible for looking after yourself. Because I almost think that, so in 12 Rules for Life by Jordan B. Peterson, he says that treat yourself as if you're someone responsible for looking after, because we are very quick to help others. And he gave the example of, for instance, a dog owner. The dog owner always gives the medication to the dog, but then people who are prescribed medication very rarely follow through with their prescribed medication. So can you just talk about how a way to separate the I that you see and the one that's in control, and then the person that is actually responsible for looking after yourself?
I always advise against kind of dividing yourself, because it's the same person, right? So sometimes we need to change the language. Sometimes it has to be about, how do I resource myself so that I can be the best leader that I can be? And how do I set an example for other people around me so that they can resource themselves, so they can fulfill their potential, so our project can be the best that it can be as well. So you also talk about it. You also talk about it, and you also show it. The ways to do that are by finding what works for you, really, to stay in the zone. I talk about how important it is to be in the leadership zone, and you cannot be in the leadership zone if you're in a toxic stress situation or a toxic stress state. You've dropped out of the leadership zone. So to reframe, what is it that keeps you in that leadership zone? How do you do that? And I always say to people, when you get on a plane, I know it's a cliche now, and they say, in the unlikely event of an accident, the airbags will come down, and you've got to put your own on first, even before. And it almost goes against what you think, right? If you're a parent, it's like you're going to put your kids. But no, because if you run out of oxygen, it's game over for them too, right? So it becomes really important, and it can also become something. I have a little bit of a problem. I'm going to be a big confession here. Probably, ruin my career instantly. But I think we have to get over the idea that we just give people a mindfulness section on the intranet or something like that. It's not about that. It's also in the way that we do meetings. If we, for instance, we become less brittle so we can take more feedback, right? So we don't armor ourselves so much. Brené Brown's just done a great piece on leadership and all the research that she's done. And she said the thing that really does for leaders is not fear. It's this armoring. It's protecting yourself all the time, against humiliation or input or whatever it might be. And we have to bring those barriers down a little bit. So it's not enough to do the mindfulness piece, the kind of breathing piece or the chewing a raisin piece, although that is incredibly useful. If in the way that we do our business or work together or are together, There's stress, there's always going to be stress inevitably put in there.
Yeah.
But we don't have a really good process for dealing with that, in that, we give feedback instantly. We don't hold on to things to someone's 360. And we allow people to take total responsibility and accountability with psychological safety and compassion and humility. And that's how we are as a team. That's what we do together. We take responsibility for it all as well.
Yeah.
As well as being able to say to each other, you know what, we're all working really hard. What can we do? Like, are we all rubbing each other up the wrong way? Do we have to have this moment? Let me give you, for instance, I'm doing a lot of work with organizations at the moment, because I do not just one-on-one work, but group work.
Yeah.
And at the moment, people have not been in the office for 15, 16 months, quite often. There may have been, they will have been new people onboarding who've never met any of the people that they work with, right? There would also be people who have been through bereavement and separation and extreme stress in their own lives because of living in these times that we've had to deal with. And so to get people to go back into the office again, let me give you an example. A client of mine went to he's a music agent, and he went to the opening night of one of the big orchestras in London. And they all sat there, and everyone was sitting there like it's quite something, and the orchestra just came on and played. And they were disappointed. The audience was disappointed because there wasn't this moment of welcome back. And then somebody else I know went to another orchestra, because these are the people that I know now. Obviously, they're classical music types, and that's the age that I'm at now, right? It's like, so someone went to this gig. No, they all go to opera now, and orchestras. And the lights went down, and the speaker went, "Welcome back, everybody." And there was a huge round of applause. And suddenly he said it was an elevating moment that brought everybody together. So at the moment, I'm being asked to go in a lot to organizations and to get them together again as a group.
Yeah.
Here, and to celebrate the group and to acknowledge what's happened. Because quite often there's been unemployment, there's been furloughs, there's been people have gone and not coming back, and they never even got to say goodbye to them. So how do we acknowledge the ghosts? How do we acknowledge everything that's gone on? How do we really look at each other and say, you know what, I appreciate the fact that you really have my back, and hold that energy of that moment and build from that. That's just such a powerful thing for me to be going into organizations and doing at the moment.
Yeah, I think
having that welcome back, here we are.
Yeah, I feel the power in that comes from the togetherness. I think, like you said, I think a lot of people have felt isolated, and in that, just the togetherness. Like you said, even when going to that classical music gig, it's like just acknowledging the fact that it's happened and saying welcome back. Those two words mean so much when you just think about it, rather than just going straight into it.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and it's my question to my friend on the first one, my client, the first one was, well, where was the leadership in that? How could they just do that? That's just like, okay, back to normal. But it was a real moment. Because also, certainly people coming back to an office space, whatever the office space is now, and they may well have changed. It may be just 2 days a week or whatever. They might, some people might never come back to the office. Is how do you bring people to that sense of belonging? And that's something that when we're together is really important. And people don't realize how important that is for any organization, right? A sense of inclusion. A sense of I belong here, a sense of, these people have got my back, is really important as a psychological, emotional need that helps people to fulfill their potential, gives them a sense of safety and connection and wanting to do their best as well. So how do you actually work on that emotional level as well? That's essentially the work of leadership.
It seems, in relation to that, it seems like that's collective compassion. Might not be the right definition, but for me as an observer, as someone who's worked in, my first job was in the civil service in the grad scheme, so we did a lot of training when it comes to listening and assertiveness training, and we did a lot of training in that grad scheme, and one of the things that I found to be interesting because that was a rotational program. So every year you change jobs and you go to a different department and you're in a completely different team. No one knows who you are and you don't know really anyone. Mm-hmm. And the interesting thing that I found is the teams that were able to get more things done quicker were those that had a sense of collective compassion for individuals, but also for the difficulty of the task, which I found to be very interesting, because what I would have thought is if you think a task is easy and you go into a task thinking it's easy, then you do better at it. But I actually found it was the opposite. It was the ones where you acknowledge it to be so difficult, and then therefore you have that collective compassion, just not for yourself, but also for the task.
Yeah. I love that story that you're telling. And if you think about the civil service, most of the things that they're doing are not going to be the easy wins. Right?
No, they're
not. Going to be pretty
taking funding away is not because I worked in finance, so
oh hell no. Okay. Yes. Yeah, so this is tricky, right? And one of the things about leadership is that and I'm in a way I'm glad that you brought this up. This collective compassion is really important for the difficulty of the task. We underestimate that so much in our lives. If you just think about relationships, for instance, any relationship.
Yeah.
It's extraordinary achievement, really, to have an ongoing, good, trusting relationship with somebody that can weather the storms.
Yeah.
And one of the essential things about leadership is that people have this idea of leadership of winning the awards, having that great sense of achievement. But actually, if you shy away from the stuff that's tough, then again, it comes back to that kind of armoring that you have. Then you're creating an unresilient team, if you like, because nobody will be able to deal with the tough stuff. Quite a lot of the time I'm dealing with leaders who do have to have those tough conversations. They can't really avoid them. Sometimes they'd like to, but they can't. Sometimes they have to make quite a lot of leaders over the last year that I've worked with have had to make people redundant, or cut back their hours, or say that they can't have the raise, or tell them that they've got to actually, take a pay cut, or they're closing an office, or, and that's really tough. If you think about the message that the government's had to give out, it's a difficult message to give, because they have to say, look, people are going to die.
Yeah.
This is a disease. We can't legislate against it. We can't even fully vaccinate against it. People are still going to get this thing, and they're still going to die, and we're going to have to accept that. Now, that's not an easy thing for today's politicians to say. It's really difficult, especially for those who are more used to, who are happier, shall we say, more comfortable with the bright new future awaits kind of message as well.
Yeah.
You have to be able to do both. And I love what you just said about collective compassion as well. You have to be able to feel into how painful that can be, so that you can move through it and grow together. If you're constantly trying to avoid it, guess what? It's going to come and kick you really, really badly. And it will affect other people. You might not notice it, but then you notice people keep leaving. You notice people taking more sick days. You notice that you don't feel happy about it anymore. That you're getting, and that your projects are falling apart.
Yeah, as to use a phrase you said earlier, which I've never heard before, you're on a cruising to a bruising. I love that. Yeah. I didn't say it earlier, but I heard that and I was like, I love that. You're on a cruising for a bruising. I'm going to use that. I thought it was a great one.
Somebody handed it to me. Now I give it to you. It's a gift.
Oh, really? Oh, okay, perfect. The chain continues.
That's it.
In reference, I'd love to know your thoughts, really, your personal thoughts, actually, in relation to some of the leadership surrounding this, specifically the UK, for anyone who's listening internationally, but around the leadership surrounding the COVID-19, because there was a lot recently around Dominic Cummings of Number 10 and Boris Johnson, the relationship there. And what's your opinion towards that from a leadership perspective? I'd just love to know your thoughts. I'm assuming, obviously, that you know like the details of it. If you don't, then maybe perhaps you just referenced it in the news, but I'd just love to know your thoughts on, is it just a lack of leadership from an organizational perspective, or how would you manage that if you were in that position?
So look, the first thing to do is for me to take politics out of it, which is difficult because we're talking about the business of politics. I'm just looking at this from a leadership point of view.
Yeah, no, obviously,
Yeah. So my political views aren't anything to do with it.
Yes.
So it kind of leads off what I was saying. Do you remember, like, at the beginning of the pandemic, all those 15 months ago? In fact, it was longer than that, because it was December, January that things started happening.
It was, yeah.
And let's, we noticed these things at the time of the emergency, but there were lots of things that were leading up to that. There was a whole context of Brexit, and there was a whole context of international global leadership. There had also been an election. And the global scene, if you like, had a certain kind of leadership that was was rising, was in, and it was fairly. It seemed from my perspective anyway, it was very much about that painting a bright new vision, and forward we go.
Yeah.
And it's almost as if, what I said earlier about what happens when the bad news comes. Are you able to turn and face it? And this had been some of the issues that we had been coming up for a long time, a long time. Someone that I know worked on the government emergency. It's kind of like the equivalent of FEMA, I guess, in America. It's a kind of government emergency committee. So what they do is they sit and they, every week or every month, they're giving that, it's the COBRA team, basically. Yeah. They're saying, look, here are the kind of alerts at the moment that we need to watch out for, we need to prepare for. And they have been saying for a long time that the number one thing that we need to watch out for is a pandemic. It's not just a case of if, it's when. And it's very difficult to see that, because we had a perfect storm, and it wasn't just political. It was also, we've had supply chains that have changed to just in time. We had social media that is just at that moment of kind of peak irresponsibility. Actually, I'm going to name that, because I mean that literally, because they were saying at the time, we are not responsible. Now they edit people. They say, well, we're not legally responsible, but we're going to self-regulate a little bit more because of things that have happened subsequently.
Yeah.
And whatever you think about that, that's a real big switch, because at the time, as I said, they were being literally, this is not our responsibility. So it was that perfect storm of stuff that happened. And then you have a leader who, in Johnson anyway, and I watched, as everybody did, I suppose, I watched his briefings, and what I saw was somebody who really didn't want to give the bad news, who really found it almost, from a character point of view, very, very difficult to give the bad news.
Yeah.
And that's also, if you like, a failure of cabinet as well. Who is he surrounding himself by? Again, a leader needs to surround himself with also dissenting voices who will push back really hard as well. And it doesn't feel like there was enough of that there, though the history needs to be written. But interestingly enough, people were looking at other places in the world and going, who were the leaders who were really doing very well in that initial moment? And there were leaders who were fantastic in that initial moment. One of the leaders that I marked out, who I thought handled it really well, was Angela Merkel. Yeah. She gave this speech in which she said, and I've got a thing of it in the book, where she said, look, we're kind of all in this together. I don't want to give this. I don't want to pull back on your freedom, because I came from East Germany. I know what it's like not to have freedom. But you know what? We're all vulnerable, and we're only as strong as the weakest link. And, but I feel for you. She really had this moment of, what? I have to give you the bad news. Yeah. However, subsequently, so for that part of the pandemic, I think she was a really great leader. And I think people like Johnson didn't do so well. They fudged it. They didn't want to, so people were like, what are we supposed to be doing? And no one really took it as seriously as Merkel got it and other people got it. So then what happens? We roll forward and they're not, in Britain, we're going back and forth and up and down. And of course, we have to remember that we are we also have to have the compassion for the people who are dealing with an extraordinary situation. Yeah,
definitely.
That is changed, and the virus doesn't care. Guess what? It's mutating. It's like whack-a-mole. You think you got it there, and up it comes there, and does it. And you've got the scientists, of course, saying, "Well, we can't give you the data that you want to give the good message because we don't see it. We're driven by data." All of this going on, so it's fascinating in a way. But what we have got right, what the government did get right, is that it was able to take a risk, because there's something about because that in a way is kind of what Johnson and Cummings and people like that are about. They're able to take a big expensive risk, which they did, and they got it right. They put a lot of money into lots of different vaccines, and they said, we'll cover you. If it doesn't work, we'll pay all the costs that it took you to do. You just got to come up with something here, guys. They just and they did, you know. Meanwhile, back in Europe, they're having a really difficult time. Now, I don't know if this is true. This is part of the story that I make up, but I do know that in Germany, for instance, and again, you might have people listening in Germany who might have something else to say about this, but because of their federalized system, they not very fond of having a centralized system because of the history of what happened in the 1930s. So it's very difficult to have a central system like the NHS that has your data and everyone's ages in it. So and they're quite risk averse. The EU does this collective negotiation, and it's got to be fair, and so it takes longer, rather than the Cummings move fast and break things kind of thing. So for different parts of this pandemic, different kinds of leadership have been useful for different things. I think we can really see that now. And for what's going to happen next is really important as well, because this thing isn't over. Like, if you think, you know, there's that old quote, isn't there? Like, what are the consequences of the French Revolution? And it's too soon to tell. And
that's a great quote.
With this as well, you can have that
thank
too
you.
if you want. With this, you're welcome. With this one as well, it's too soon to tell. A lot of the things that happened as a consequence of the financial crisis are still with us. I think Trump is very much a consequence of, and the mindset. It's not just that, but I think that, you know, I think it's exacerbated. I think that has a lot to do with it. And I think there may well be some major shifts that come from this that we can't see yet, that, you know, in 10, 20, 30 years, we'll look back and say, that was when this started to happen.
Yeah, that hindsight thing is a big one. I actually think, in reference to Trump, I actually think that was a mistake Joe Biden made, is that he didn't acknowledge how toxic Donald Trump was when he assumed office. Perhaps he did and I didn't see it, but I it's almost as if they just went, oh, that was a bad dream, let's just not think about that and let's move forward. And I think he should have done the opposite and been like, how did it get to that point where that happened, and how can we address that? Because it was really bad, and it got to the stage towards the end, I feel like, whereas people just accepted it. It was like acceptance. It's like, yeah, he does what he is, that is what he is, and we'll just have to deal with it, kind of thing, and ride out the storm. But
yeah, well, this isn't the first time that America has had to deal with demagogues, and it will be interesting to see what the lessons of history are, and, you know, how it was dealt with before, and what the hope is now as well. Because, you know, whether you're on the left or the right, I think is immaterial. What is important is a faith in democracy with all of its flaws, you know. And you know, you were speaking Arabic. I've spent a bit of time in the Middle East, and I remember I was in Syria before the war, and in Jordan, and obviously you couldn't really have a conversation about politics in Syria at the time, nor now. But I remember being in Lebanon and quoting that old chestnut about, I think it was Churchill or somebody else, who said, you know, democracy is the least worst option. And, you know, some of the people in Lebanon I was talking to in Beirut said, well, no, actually, it's not. You know, we have democracy and it's chaos. It's absolute chaos, and we haven't had stability or a stable government, or we've got corrupt politicians, and then their nepotism. And so, you know what? Like, actually, a benign dictatorship might be quite nice in a way. So we have to remember that you know, our systems of democracy are very locally, regionally, historically constructed. And we need to remember, rather than seeing them as an inviolable fact, we need to really respect them and fight for them every day.
Yeah,
you know?
definitely.
And
I can
the way that we, you know.
Second that sentiment. Like, I've visited like Iraq a lot of times, and it's interesting because a lot of individuals, especially around sort of like the 50-60-year-old period, where during Saddam's reign, were actually like profiting from him being a dictator, because they obviously he obviously was very brutal in the way he treated minorities, but for the large majority of people, they benefited from him being a dictator. And they almost wish, some people actually wish, and I saw a video about this, some people wish for him to be, or for someone like that to be, because they give that element of structure and they solidify the country to a degree, and it's not this power vacuum. So yeah, it's an interesting point that you make, and it's the interesting relationship is like, it's not a one size fits all. And it's very difficult sometimes, I think, for people in the Western world to see that in relation to other countries in Eastern cultures.
Yeah, yeah. You know, we're very privileged, and we have to remember that is, you know, that's contingent.
Yeah.
And maybe in this situation with Trump, and I also don't want to kind of demonize people who voted for him, who felt that he actually was in a way speaking their truth, because I think that that's really important as well. You know, the bigger question is not Trump; it's about how that you've got such, in America, a place that I lived for 5 years, you've got such division, and I think it's here as well in Britain. I don't think it's really, it's starting to be talked about, but I think the political parties are struggling with it. The Labour Party especially, you know, there's such division. There's been such a way that certain people have been left behind. Yeah. And even in America, there's a famous picture, you know, I lived in New York, and there was a famous picture of when you fly over America, you've got like New York, Washington, Boston, and then blah, and then California, you know, and it was filler. You call them the filler states. Well, you know what? They're not the filler states. They're full of people trying to make a living, taking care of their families. So let's not diss them. Let's have that collective compassion that you were talking about earlier as well, so that we can actually move on. And there's you know, the idea is that in future that the great leadership won't come from an individual, that it'll come from a circle. It'll come from, you know, a group of people who are connecting together, you know, despite their differences. Yeah. And I think that there's really something to be said for that as well. You know, definitely. Nobody's coming to save us. I don't mean that in a nihilistic way. Yeah. I mean it, you know, I feel very passionate about self-leadership. You know, let's all step up. You know, if you don't like Trump, or you believe in this, great. We'll take some positive action about it, but do it with compassion, without dividing people, without an us and them situation, which I see coming up now around the vaccines. You know, who's been vaccinated, who hasn't, who believes in it, who hasn't. You know, I even feel myself armoring a little bit when I think about this. And I have to do my own work to de-armor so that I can listen and engage and talk to people as well, and be in that conversation with people.
I feel
that too is leadership.
That is, and I think that's the change at the moment, especially on social and just in general. It's very much about us and them, and it's very toxic in the sense of argumentative. Yeah. But you can't, in my mind, you can't move to education if you're in that state, because education can only happen when you've got both sides listening. And I know we haven't touched upon really listening. We have done a bit, but I would like to have talked about it a bit more. But I definitely think the topics that we've talked about today are very important around leadership. Just to end it, we are a books podcast, and I think it'd be great for you to perhaps give some of the ones that have had an impact on you and think that are required reading for our listeners.
Yeah, well, I guess... that's a great one for leadership. For leadership, it almost doesn't matter as long as you do read and you engage. You know, I was saying about being lonely. You need the inputs of podcasts. You need the inputs of reading. You need the inputs of articles. Definitely. The thing that really, really influences me, there's a guy called, in a way, it's a bigger stage of leadership, a guy called Bill Plotkin, who's based in Colorado. And he writes about what he calls soulcraft, or if you like, soul leadership. And the idea here is that we are all looking to grow. And sometimes the stuckness that we feel is that we've reached a certain part of our development where we've learned everything that we could from a certain stage of our lives. And now we're ready to grow. And most of us keep our lives in a very adolescent state. And there's nothing wrong with that. It can be a very healthy adolescent, you know, being social, reaping the ego rewards. Again, nothing wrong with that. But at a certain point, you might feel the call. And at the moment, if you think about our world and the way it is in many ways, you know, we're being asked some really hard questions. You know, there's a way of thinking about what's happening in the world around things like climate change, that we might need to look at our behaviors and to think about, well, how can I think more about the impact that I'm having? How can I act less like an adolescent in the ego state and more like an adult? And those are the really big questions that are coming out. So Bill Plotkin's work on that, I think is really, really important as well. I always say something sort of like Brené Brown is really useful as well. And I would also say read poetry.
Okay.
Sounds a strange thing to do, but you know, read poetry to nourish those parts of you that are not, because poetry is really good at making associations and painting pictures and affecting your heart. And you need to keep nourishing that, because otherwise we're in danger as leaders of turning into technocrats all the time, rather than being able to appeal, to feed the emotion of the heart. So people like Rilke and Mary, it doesn't really matter who it is. You know, Mary Oliver is a good one. Rilke is a great one. David White, just to keep nourishing that heart space all the time, so that when you move out into the world again, you're not just operating from your head. You can really connect as well, and it's nourishing that visionary part of you as well. Gets you out of the spreadsheet and into the numinous.
Yeah, I always think that, especially in relation to non-fiction books, because I think there's a lot that can be learned from non-fiction books, but it definitely doesn't tap into the side on the creativity side. So yeah, I love those recommendations, and I can't wait to read more about them. Thank you so much for joining us, Fiona, and talking about your book, Thoughtful Leadership, A Guide to Leading with the Mind, Body and Soul. Where's the best place that individuals can find you, whether it be for your book or for your courses or...
So the best place to find me is FionaBucklandCoaching.com. You can also, I'm on Instagram and, LinkedIn and all of those kind of places as well. I'm not massively active because I believe in doing rather than just being on social media. There isn't much of a discrimination.
Yes.
And I'm also running courses as well. You know, there's a course that runs with the book as well. So get to my website, sign up to my mailing list. And then you'll hear first about the course as well, which is really, really amazing. I've just finished the run through of it, like the first running of the course. And oh my God, the people on it were incredible. Like it's a small group, like 12 people, and it's sensational people on it. So if you're looking for a community, listen, I'm not even saying it for myself. I'm saying it for the quality and the conversations that you'll have about leadership is extraordinary.
Definitely. I'm glad to hear it, and best of luck with the courses and the best of luck with the book as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Really enjoyed the conversation today. Really did. It was lovely, like chatting.
Yes.
Only more so.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to this podcast. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe for more content. Also, visit our website, www.booktalktoday.com, to subscribe and download the latest edition of our magazine. Join our mailing list to receive the first issue for free, to get a taste for the value-packed content that we are offering. Book Talk Today, for readers, by readers.